that Boko Haram first of all attacked the military base just outside of Baga and overwhelmed the soldiers stationed there. They moved inside Baga town and shot civilians in their homes, in the streets, and as they tried to flee into the surrounding bush. After doing so, Boko Haram moved on to other towns in the area where they continued to deliberately target civilians. Based on our interviews with witnesses, we believe that the death toll could be as many as 2,000 people, and this would make it the deadliest attack by Boko Haram so far.
The deadliest attack by Boko Haram really says something. This is an especially brutal organization. You know them from almost a year ago when we began to speak of them kidnapping such large groups of young girls they did not want to have in school, but they have brutalized those girls from what we understand. Hilary Matfess is with Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Hilary, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Good to have you. And Nnamdi Obasi, International Crisis Group, thank you, sir, for taking the time.
Thank you very much.
All right. Now, the Archbishop of Nigeria has come out and said, Hillary, that Western countries are not stepping it up. He chose this time, but even though we've heard of these brutal attacks, as we just saw in that clip, this group has essentially just been brutal right from the get-go. It's not necessarily something new.
Yeah, I'll push back against that a little bit. Boko Haram was actually founded in 2002 as a nonviolent reformist group focused on local politicians. It only accelerated and turned into the sort of insurgency that we recognize it to be today in 2009 after the Nigerian government's offensive against them that killed an estimated 700 people, including both militants and civilians. And since the state of emergency was declared in 2013, spring of 2013, we've seen the insurgency become even more lethal. So I'll push back against you saying that they've been violent from the get-go. Really, it's been an interplay between the radicalization of the insurgency and the government's attempts to root out these insurgents that have allowed it to metastasize into what it is today.
Well, I appreciate that, Hillary, because I guess when I'm saying that, it's from the get-go in our knowledge of them, because we paid no attention, and the Archbishop is right to the extent that we don't pay a whole lot of attention as to what happens in Nigeria. But Nnamdi is, now we've got a group that certainly presents itself as one of the more brutal groups in the world, and is the Archbishop right that the rest of us are really kind of concentrating on Paris and other things that happen and really kind of not too worried about what goes on in Nigeria?
Yes, I think he's perfectly right. I have traveled within the area. There is a very deep sense of disappointment and abandonment. And it's not just about the international community, it's also even about the Nigerian community. There is a sense of indifference to what is happening in the Northeast. There is not sufficient media engagement. Apart from the short period of the World Economic Summit, World Economic Forum, where foreign journalists were in Nigeria to cover the conference, and then also reported on Boko Haram, there have been inadequate attention to the issues in the international media. So people feel the international media has not focused enough and consistently enough on the conflict. The military support for the country hasn't been comparable to perhaps what you would find in some other countries. And then, of course, the humanitarian response to the crisis also falls very much short. So for all of those reasons, people in the region feel very much abandoned and very much disappointed, not only with the Nigerian government, but the international community as well.
All right, Hillary, let's start, though, with the Nigerian government. From what I'm understanding from what you're saying, maybe they started some of this and caused some of this, but now you've got this vicious group to deal with. Are they doing enough for their own people?
Well, there's a lot of disappointment with the Nigerian government's response thus far, and the disappointment is twofold. First of all, I think that a lot of Nigerians and many in the international community feel that the Nigerian government isn't doing enough in its efforts. And the second issue is that when the Nigerian government does deploy security forces, there have been widespread reports of gross human rights violations and abuses by the Nigerian security sector. So people feel not only abandoned by their government, but then persecuted by it. And Boko Haram has really capitalized upon that sense of marginalization and abandonment in their public rhetoric, in their attempts to recruit people, and in their organizational ideology.
Well, yeah, I can understand that because of the accusations of what the security forces might themselves be doing, this is why the United States doesn't want to provide weaponry to Nigerian forces, correct?
I think that's absolutely part of the reason. The Nigerian military itself has a long and complicated history with the country, as you can imagine, having gone through several military dictatorships. But I think the United States is right to be a little bit cautious about giving the Nigerian military carte blanche with aid, given the fact that it hasn't shown a real dedication to abiding by the rule of law in its response to Boko Haram.
Well, Nnamdi, the Archbishop comes out and he says that the West is not concerned enough and not doing enough. But in fact, does Nigeria want forces from other countries to come in and help fight Boko Haram?
No, certainly there is a very strong feeling that, you don't need forces from outside on ground, and many Nigerians would, feel a compromise on their pride and sense of sovereignty if you have foreign soldiers fighting in Nigeria. They think Nigerians are capable of handling the situation, perhaps if they had sufficient support. And it's not just in terms of lethal military equipment, but everything from training to logistics to medical evacuation to airlift facilities. There's a shortage, virtually across the spectrum, and people feel that the international community hasn't been as helpful to the Nigerian government, as it could have been. I mean, not to say the Nigerian government has helped itself either, but then, people feel that other countries in comparative situations, maybe Egypt, maybe Pakistan, have gotten a lot more sympathy from the international community than Nigeria has got.
Well, as the Archbishop was bringing this story to the fore again, and I'm glad that he did it, and that we're talking about Boko Haram again, he has said, Nnamdi, that the slaughter in Baga showed that the Nigerian military was unable to take on Boko Haram. So perhaps this can't be solved internally.
Well, for now, I mean, the Nigerian military has not, performed creditably in managing Boko Haram. People are very much disappointed about the performance of the military. We try to be understanding of the complexity of the situation. This was not anticipated. The intelligence, preceding the conflict was very weak. The military is considerably undermanned. It's under-equipped. The logistics is weak. Morale is low. And then there's also the issue of corruption and mismanagement of defense procurement. So for all of these reasons, there are internal problems. But the chance of a negotiated settlement about this is rather very slim. We in International Crisis Group have consistently advocated for a broadening of the military strategy, of the counterinsurgency strategy, not only concentrating on, the military operations, that is necessary, but also trying to work on other areas, improving on social services within the region, in the long term, in order to reduce the recruitment of young people, unemployed and poor people into the group, improving on coordination with neighboring countries, to stop the influx of arms and other support that the group is benefiting from. But so far, the Nigerian government hasn't been very forthcoming on all those other issues.
Hillary and Nnamdi are going to stay with me, and we will continue on the story of Boko Haram next on Straight Talk. Discussing the fact that the Catholic Archbishop in Nigeria has reached out to the West and accused the West of not showing sufficient interest in doing something about the violent Boko Haram group in Nigeria, the one that kidnapped hundreds of young girls, has most recently, it would seem, used some young girls as young as 10 as suicide bombers. A particularly violent group is constituted today. And I'm talking to Hillary Matfess, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and Nnamdi Obasi, International Crisis Group. Hillary, I wonder if Western countries perhaps have not seemed to have been as focused on Boko Haram because we feel that maybe that's an internal Nigerian issue. They don't threaten to flop out across the border like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. Would you think that's the thinking, and would it be a legitimate view of Boko Haram?
Well, so many people, I think, have tried to connect Boko Haram to Al-Qaeda or to AQIM, some of its offshoots. I personally disagree with that take. I think that African coverage in general is typically overlooked by the American media and by Western media. So I think the fact that Boko Haram has been ignored up until now is largely a symptom of just our broader media practices. And I think that the success of the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls campaign also sort of speaks to the stories that we would like to hear. We heard a lot of noise about bringing back our girls, but I hope that your team can pull up a map that I sent them earlier demonstrating all of the female-led suicide bombings in Nigeria and attempted female suicide bombings in Nigeria. And all of these have taken place since the girls have been abducted. So there's very much a drive to bring back our girls and engage in these uplifting stories, but very little desire to look at some of the harsher facts about how these girls are being used and the realities of the situation on the ground.
Namdi, would you concur with what Hillary has said?
Yeah, my sense on the ground is that people feel there is a deliberate effort by Western countries to play down this as a local conflict in order not to get sucked in, and not to get too much involved if there are no real strategic interests involved. And I have been, it's been pointed out to me again and again that the group is not just targeting Nigerian interests and Nigerian territory, but that it has actually made statements and carried out actions that show that it has a much larger, a much longer-term international goal. For instance, the attack on the United Nations building in 2011 was not an attack on a Nigerian target, but an attack on an international target. And then the group has listed the leaders of the United States, the United Nations, the UK and France and Israel and so on as some of its enemies it would be fighting. But then, over time, there is a consistent reference to this as a local conflict. It does appear that it might be a local conflict until Boko Haram gains enough ground and enough strength to then roll out fully what might be a major international challenge.
Well,
I'm sorry, if I may respectfully counter that claim. The attack on the UN facilities in 2011 was the only attack that Boko Haram is engaged in on an international target throughout its history, and it didn't seek to repeat those sorts of attacks. In fact, since the state of emergency was declared in May of 2013, attacks have actually focused away from urban areas and into the rural areas, suggesting a much more rural, local strategy. Since the state of emergency was declared, the Nigerian Social Violence Project's dataset has cataloged over 60 attacks on villages, not necessarily international targets. Boko Haram has not demonstrated any real desire to partner with al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, Ansar al-Din, al-Shabaab, or al-Qaeda. So I do believe that this is largely a Nigerian insurgency. The few forays that they've had into Cameroon have only been in response to the Cameroonian troops' attempts to squelch Boko Haram in the face of Nigerian incapacity. So as much as I respect the work that the International Crisis Group does, I respectfully disagree with that perception of the insurgency.
Well, I think it's true that in the West, unless occasionally some celebrity group tells us about a famine in Africa and we get temporarily engaged because of a song or something, for the most part, unless we would see what we think is a danger to the West from Africa, Hillary, I don't think the West pays much attention to Africa at all.
I absolutely agree with you.
Nabi, how would you respond to that?
Well, responding to the point Hillary made earlier on, I don't know how many attacks it would take on international targets, to conclude that this is a group that has goals beyond terrorizing Nigeria. Would we wait for another attack on the United Nations or on the British embassy or on the U.S. embassy or something like that? They've made the point well enough. If they've been held in check by Nigerian security over the last 2 years, that is not that they have entirely disclaimed international goals. The leader of the group has said repeatedly that they are fighting against the world, against democracy, against secular system, against Western values and so on and so forth. So it's not just a local conflict.
All right. Excuse me, I'm sorry, we're going to hit some satellite out times and lose people, so and we're up against the news, but I hope we can have you both back and we can concentrate on this story. Thank you very much.